I was 12 years old when Kwame came to live with us. His mother had died suddenly, and since my father was his only surviving uncle, he was sent to our village to stay with us. We all felt sorry for him, of course. Losing a mother is a wound that never truly heals, and I remember how quiet he was those first few weeks, his eyes always downcast, his shoulders slumped like he carried a heavy load. But there was something else about him, something that made my grandmother frown whenever she looked in his direction. "It is not the boy," she murmured one evening as she pounded cassava in the courtyard. "It is what follows him." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant, but looking back, I think she had seen the signs long before any of us had. Kwame's father had remarried soon after his mother's death. His new wife, Auntie Adjoa, was a quiet woman, younger than his father, and she rarely spoke unless spoken to. I remember the first time she visited our home, the way she kept her head slightly bowed, her movements slow and deliberate. She carried herself like a shadow, slipping into the background of any gathering. "She is mourning too," my mother had said, when I asked why she always seemed so distant. When you marry a man who has lost his wife, the ghost of the first wife lingers. I had never thought about that before, but the way my mother said it sent a strange feeling through me, like a chill despite the heat of the day. Kwame never spoke much about his stepmother, but sometimes when we lay on our woven mats at night, he would whisper things that made my stomach turn. "She stands outside my door at night," he once told me. "I can hear her breathing." "Maybe she's checking on you," I suggested, though the thought made my skin crawl. He shook his head. "She never knocks." For a while, I convinced myself he was imagining things. He had lost his mother, after all. Sometimes grief plays tricks on the mind, but then things started happening that I could not explain. One night, I woke up to use the latrine and saw a figure standing in the courtyard. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the ground. At first, I thought it was my grandmother, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was Auntie Adjoa. She was standing completely still, facing the tree where my father hung his hunting charms. She did not move, did not make a sound. The next morning, I told Kwame what I had seen. His face grew pale. "She does that at home too," he whispered. "She stands in front of my father's hunting bag, just staring." A few nights later, I saw her again. This time she was standing closer to the house, near the doorway of our sleeping quarters. I didn't wake anyone. I wasn't even sure if I was seeing things myself. But the next morning, Kwame refused to eat. "She was inside," he told me. "I heard her whispering my name." I tried to tell my mother, but she waved me off. "You children are always imagining things," she said. "Maybe she walks at night because she has trouble sleeping. Leave her be." But I could not leave it be. One night, I pretended to be asleep and waited. The fire in the courtyard had died down to glowing embers, and the night was silent except for the occasional call of an owl. I kept my eyes half closed, watching the doorway, and sure enough, after some time, I saw her. She moved slowly, stepping into the room without a sound. She wore a simple wrapper, her long braids hanging over her shoulders. But her face, it was wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. Her features seemed stretched, as if something inside her was pressing against her skin, trying to get out. She walked past me, straight to Kwame. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. She leaned over him, her lips moving in silent words. Then she reached out and placed a hand on his forehead. Kwame gasped and sat up suddenly, his eyes wide with terror. Auntie Adjoa turned sharply, her gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, not a warm, motherly smile, but something cold and knowing. Without a word, she stood and slipped out of the room, disappearing into the night. The next morning, Kwame fell sick. His body burned with fever, and his voice became hoarse from coughing. My mother and grandmother did everything they could, herbal teas, prayers, baths in cool water, but nothing helped. Meanwhile, Auntie Adjoa sat in the corner of the compound, quietly weaving a mat, never once looking in his direction. It was my grandmother who finally broke the silence. She stood up suddenly, her walking stick striking the ground. "Enough," she said. Then she turned to Auntie Adjoa. "Who are you?" Auntie Adjoa looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "I am his father's wife." My grandmother shook her head. "Number, that is what you pretend to be, but I see you now." The air in the compound grew heavy. Even my mother, who had dismissed my fears, stood frozen. Auntie Adjoa remained still for a long moment. Then she stood, smoothing down her wrapper. "You are old," she said to my grandmother, "but you see too much." That night, she left. She did not say goodbye, did not take any of her belongings. By morning, she was gone. Kwame's fever broke the following day. Slowly, he regained his strength, but he never spoke of his stepmother again. His father sent word months later that she had disappeared without a trace. Some said she had gone back to her people. Others whispered that she had never truly been human to begin with. As for my grandmother, she never spoke of it again either. But sometimes I would catch her staring at the empty place where Auntie Adjoa used to sit, her face lined with something that looked a lot like fear. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join the family here at Sankofa Fables Tales. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on more captivating tales and adventures. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to share more with you.